Quantum consciousness. The quantum mind, or quantum consciousness, is a group of hypotheses proposing that local physical laws and interactions from classical mechanics or connections between neurons alone cannot explain consciousness. These hypotheses posit instead that quantum mechanical phenomena, such as entanglement and superposition that cause non-localized quantum effects, interacting in smaller features of the brain than cells, may play an important part in the brain's function and could explain critical aspects of consciousness. These scientific hypotheses are as yet unvalidated, and they can overlap with quantum mysticism. History. Eugene Wigner developed the idea that quantum mechanics has something to do with the workings of the mind. 2. He proposed that the wave function collapses due to its interaction with consciousness. Freeman Dyson argued that mind, as manifested by the capacity to make choices, is to some extent inherent in every electron. Other contemporary physicists and philosophers considered these arguments unconvincing. Victor Stenger characterized quantum consciousness as a myth having no scientific basis that should take its place along with gods, unicorns, and dragons. David Chalmers argues against quantum consciousness. He instead discusses how quantum mechanics may relate to dualistic consciousness. Chalmers is skeptical that any new physics can resolve the hard problem of consciousness. He argues that quantum theories of consciousness suffer from the same weakness as more conventional theories. Just as he argues that there is no particular reason why specific macroscopic physical features in the brain should give rise to consciousness, he also thinks that there is no specific reason why a particular quantum feature, such as the EM field in the brain, should give rise to consciousness either. David Bohm viewed quantum theory and relativity as contradictory, which implied a more fundamental level in the universe. He claimed that both quantum theory and relativity pointed to this deeper theory, a quantum field theory. This more fundamental level was proposed to represent an undivided wholeness and an implicate order from which arises the explicate order of the universe as we experience it. Bohm's proposed order applies both to matter and consciousness. He suggested that it could explain the relationship between them. He saw mind and matter as projections into our explicate order from the underlying implicate order. Bohm claimed that when we look at matter, we see nothing that helps us to understand consciousness. Bohm never proposed a specific means by which his proposal could be falsified, nor a neural mechanism through which his implicate order could emerge in a way relevant to consciousness. He later collaborated on Carl Pribram's holonomic brain theory as a model of quantum consciousness. David Bohm also collaborated with Basil Hilly on work that claimed mind and matter both emerge from an implicate order. Hilly in turn worked with philosopher Paavo Pilkkonen. According to Pilkkonen, Bohm's suggestion leads naturally to the assumption that the physical correlate of the logical thinking process is at the classically describable level of the brain, while the basic thinking process is at the quantum theoretically describable level. Penrose and Hameroff. Theoretical physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff collaborated to produce the theory known as orchestrated objective reduction, OR. Penrose and Hameroff initially developed their ideas separately and later collaborated to produce OR in the early 1990s. They reviewed and updated their theory in 2013. Penrose's argument stemmed from Gödel's incompleteness theorems. In his first book on consciousness, The Emperor's New Mind, 1989, he argued that while a formal system cannot prove its own consistency, Gödel's unprovable results are provable by human mathematicians. Penrose took this to mean that human mathematicians are not formal proof systems and not running a computable algorithm. According to Bringsjord and Shao, this line of reasoning is based on fallacious equivocation on the meaning of computation. In the same book, Penrose wrote, "One might speculate, however, that somewhere deep in the brain, cells are to be found of single quantum sensitivity. If this proves to be the case, then quantum mechanics will be significantly involved in brain activity." Penrose determined that wave function collapse was the only possible physical basis for a non-computable process. Dissatisfied with its randomness, He proposed a new form of wave function collapse that occurs in isolation and called it objective reduction. He suggested each quantum superposition has its own piece of space-time curvature, and that when these become separated by more than one Planck length, they become unstable and collapse. Penrose suggested that objective reduction represents neither randomness nor algorithmic processing, but instead a non-computable influence in space-time geometry from which mathematical understanding and, by later extension, consciousness derives. Hameroff provided a hypothesis that microtubules would be suitable hosts for quantum behavior. Microtubules are composed of tubulin protein dimer subunits. The dimers each have hydrophobic pockets that are 8 nanometers apart and may contain delocalized pi electrons. Tubulins have other smaller nonpolar regions that contain pi electron-rich indole rings separated by about 2 nanometers. Hameroff proposed that these electrons are close enough to become entangled. He originally suggested that the tubulin subunit electrons would form a Bose-Einstein condensate, but this was discredited. He then proposed a Froelich condensate, a hypothetical coherent oscillation of dipolar molecules, but this too was experimentally discredited. For instance, the proposed predominance of A-lattice microtubules, more suitable for information processing, was falsified by Kikuwa et al., who showed that all in vivo microtubules have a B-lattice and a seam. Orchestroir predicted that microtubule coherence reaches the synapses through dendritic lamellar bodies, DLBs, but de Zoet et al. Proved this impossible by showing that DLBs are micrometers away from gap junctions. In 2014, Hameroff and Penrose claimed that the discovery of quantum vibrations in microtubules by Anirban Bandyopadhyay of the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan in March 2013 corroborates Orchestroir theory. Experiments that showed that anesthetic drugs reduce how long microtubules can sustain suspected quantum excitations appear to support the quantum theory of consciousness. In April 2022, the results of 2 related experiments at the University of Alberta and Princeton University were announced at the Science of Consciousness Conference, providing further evidence to support quantum processes operating within microtubules. In a study Stuart Hameroff was part of, Jack Tuzinski of the University of Alberta demonstrated that aesthetics hasten the duration of a process called delayed luminescence, in which microtubules and tubulins re-emit trapped light. Tuzinski suspects that the phenomenon has a quantum origin, with superradiance being investigated as one possibility. In the second experiment, Gregory D. Scholes and Eric Kulra of Princeton University used lasers to excite molecules within tubulins, causing a prolonged excitation to diffuse through microtubules further than expected, which did not occur when repeated under anesthesia. However, diffusion results have to be interpreted carefully, since even classical diffusion can be very complex due to the wide range of length scales in the fluid-filled extracellular space. 35, nevertheless, University of Oxford quantum physicist Vlatko Vedral told that this connection with consciousness is a really long shot. Also in 2022, a group of Italian physicists conducted several experiments that failed to provide evidence in support of a gravity-related quantum collapse model of consciousness, weakening the possibility of a quantum explanation for consciousness. Although these theories are stated in a scientific framework, it is difficult to separate them from scientists' personal opinions. The opinions are often based on intuition or subjective ideas about the nature of consciousness. For example, Penrose wrote, "My own point of view asserts that you can't even simulate conscious activity. What's going on in conscious thinking is something you couldn't properly imitate at all by computer. If something behaves as though it's conscious, do you say it is conscious?" People argue endlessly about that. Some people would say, well, you've got to take the operational viewpoint. We don't know what consciousness is. How do you judge whether a person is conscious or not? Only by the way they act. You apply the same criterion to a computer or a computer-controlled robot. Other people would say, no, you can't say it feels something merely because it behaves as though it feels something. My view is different from both those views. The robot wouldn't even behave convincingly as though it was conscious unless it really was, which I say it couldn't be. if it's entirely computationally controlled. Penrose continues, "A lot of what the brain does you could do on a computer. I'm not saying that all the brain's action is completely different from what you do on a computer. I am claiming that the actions of consciousness are something different. I'm not saying that consciousness is beyond physics, either, although I'm saying that it's beyond the physics we know now. My claim is that there has to be something in physics that we don't yet understand, which is very important and which is of a non-computational character. It's not specific to our brains. It's out there in the physical world, but it usually plays a totally insignificant role. It would have to be in the bridge between quantum and classical levels of behavior, that is, where quantum measurement comes in." Umezawa, Vitiello, Freeman. Hiromi Umezawa and collaborators proposed a quantum field theory of memory storage. Giuseppe Vitiello and Walter Freeman proposed a dialogue model of the mind. This dialogue takes place between the classical and the quantum parts of the brain. Their quantum field theory models of brain dynamics are fundamentally different from the Penrose-Hameroff theory. Quantum brain dynamics, as described by Harold Atmanspaker. Since quantum theory is the most fundamental theory of matter that is currently available, it is a legitimate question to ask whether quantum theory can help us to understand consciousness. The original motivation in the early 20th century for relating quantum theory to consciousness was essentially philosophical. It is fairly plausible that conscious free decisions, free will, are problematic in a perfectly deterministic world, so quantum randomness might indeed open up novel possibilities for free will. On the other hand, randomness is problematic for goal-directed volition. Ricciardi and Umezawa proposed in 1967 a general theory of quanta of long-range coherent waves within and between brain cells and showed a possible mechanism of memory storage and retrieval in terms of Nambu, Goldstone bosons. Mari Jibu and Kunio Yaju later popularized these results under the name quantum brain dynamics, QBD, as the hypothesis to explain the function of the brain within the framework of quantum field theory with implications on consciousness. Pribram. Carl Pribram's holonomic brain theory, quantum holography, invoked quantum field theory to explain higher-order processing of memory in the brain. He argued that his holonomic model solved the binding problem. Pribram collaborated with Bohm in his work on quantum approaches to the thought process. Pribram suggested much of the processing in the brain was done in distributed fashion. He proposed that the fine-fibered, felt-like dendritic fields might follow the principles of quantum field theory when storing and retrieving long-term memory. Stapp. Henry Stapp proposed that quantum waves are reduced only when they interact with consciousness. He argues from the orthodox quantum mechanics of John von Neumann that the quantum state collapses when the observer selects one among the alternative quantum possibilities as a basis for future action. The collapse, therefore, takes place in the expectation that the observer associated with the state. Stapp's work drew criticism from scientists such as David Bourget and Danko Djordjev. Catecholinergic neuron electron transport, CNET. CNET is a hypothesized neural signaling mechanism in catecholinergic neurons that would use quantum mechanical electron transport. The hypothesis is based in part on the observation by many independent researchers that electron tunneling occurs in ferritin, an iron storage protein that is prevalent in those neurons at room temperature and ambient conditions. The hypothesized function of this mechanism is to assist in action selection, but the mechanism itself would be capable of integrating millions of cognitive and sensory neural signals using a physical mechanism associated with strong electron-electron interactions. Each tunneling event would involve a collapse of an electron wave function, but the collapse would be incidental to the physical effect created by strong electron-electron interactions. CNET predicted a number of physical properties of these neurons that have been subsequently observed experimentally, such as electron tunneling in substantia nigra pars compacta, SNC, tissue and the presence of disordered arrays of ferritin in SNC tissues. The hypothesis also predicted that disordered ferritin arrays like those found in SNC tissue should be capable of supporting long-range electron transport and providing a switching or routing function. both of which have also been subsequently observed. Another prediction of CNET was that the largest SNC neurons should mediate action selection. This prediction was contrary to earlier proposals about the function of those neurons at that time, which were based on predictive reward dopamine signaling. A team led by Dr. Pascal Kaiser of Harvard Medical School subsequently demonstrated that those neurons do in fact code movement, consistent with the earlier predictions of CNET. While the CNET mechanism has not yet been directly observed, it may be possible to do so using quantum.fluorophores tagged to ferritin or other methods for detecting electron tunneling. CNET is applicable to a number of different consciousness models as a binding or action selection mechanism, such as integrated information theory, IIT, and sensor-motor theory, SMT. It is noted that many existing models of consciousness fail to specifically address action selection or binding. For example, Oregon and no-call binding a pseudo-problem, but also state that the fact that object attributes seem perceptually to be part of a single object does not require them to be represented in any unified kind of way, for example, at a single location in the brain or by a single process. They may be so represented, but there is no logical necessity for this. Simply because there is no logical necessity for a physical phenomenon does not mean that it does not exist, or that once it is identified that it can be ignored. Likewise, global workspace theory, GWT, models appear to treat dopamine as modulatory, based on the prior understanding of those neurons from predictive reward dopamine signaling research, but GWT models could be adapted to include modeling of moment-by-moment activity in the striatum to mediate action selection, as observed by Kaiser. CNET is applicable to those neurons as a selection mechanism for that function, as otherwise that function could result in seizures from simultaneous actuation of competing sets of neurons. While CNET by itself is not a model of consciousness, it is able to integrate different models of consciousness through neural binding and action selection. However, a more complete understanding of how CNET might relate to consciousness would require a better understanding of strong electron-electron interactions in ferritin arrays, which implicates the many-body problem. Criticism. These hypotheses of the quantum mind remain hypothetical speculation, as Penrose admits in his discussions. Until they make a prediction that is tested by experimentation, the hypotheses are not based on empirical evidence. In 2010, Lawrence Krauss was guarded in criticizing Penrose's ideas. He said, "Roger Penrose has given lots of New Age crackpots ammunition. Many people are dubious that Penrose's suggestions are reasonable because the brain is not an isolated quantum mechanical system. To some extent it could be because memories are stored at the molecular level, and at a molecular level quantum mechanics is significant." According to Krauss, it is true that quantum mechanics is extremely strange, and on extremely small scales for short times, all sorts of weird things happen. And in fact, we can make weird quantum phenomena happen. But what quantum mechanics doesn't change about the universe is if you want to change things, you still have to do something. You can't change the world by thinking about it. The process of testing the hypotheses with experiments is fraught with conceptual/theoretical, practical, and ethical problems. Conceptual problems. The idea that a quantum effect is necessary for consciousness to function is still in the realm of philosophy. Penrose proposes that it is necessary, but other theories of consciousness do not indicate that it is needed. For example, Daniel Dennett proposed a theory called multiple drafts model, which doesn't indicate that quantum effects are needed, in his 1991 book Consciousness Explained. A philosophical argument on either side is not a scientific proof, although philosophical analysis can indicate key differences in the types of models and show what type of experimental differences might be observed. But since there is no clear consensus among philosophers, there is no conceptual support that a quantum mind theory is needed. A possible conceptual approach is to use quantum mechanics as an analogy to understand a different field of study like consciousness, without expecting that the laws of quantum physics will apply. An example of this approach is the idea of Schrödinger's cat. Erwin Schrödinger described how one could, in principle, create entanglement of a large-scale system by making it dependent on an elementary particle in a superposition. He proposed a scenario with a cat in a locked steel chamber, wherein the cat's survival depended on the state of a radioactive atom, whether it had decayed and emitted radiation. According to Schrödinger, the Copenhagen interpretation implies that the cat is both alive and dead until the state has been observed. Schrödinger did not wish to promote the idea of dead and alive cats as a serious possibility. He intended the example to illustrate the absurdity of the existing view of quantum mechanics. But since Schrödinger's time, physicists have given other interpretations of the mathematics of quantum mechanics, some of which regard the alive and dead cat superposition as quite real. Schrödinger's famous thought experiment poses the question of when a system stops existing as a quantum superposition of states. In the same way, one can ask whether the act of making a decision is analogous to having a superposition of states of two decision outcomes, so that making a decision means opening the box to reduce the brain from a combination of states to one state. This analogy of decision-making uses a formalism derived from quantum mechanics, but does not indicate the actual mechanism by which the decision is made. In this way, the idea is similar to quantum cognition. This field clearly distinguishes itself from the quantum mind, as it is not reliant on the hypothesis that there is something microphysical quantum mechanical about the brain. Quantum cognition is based on the quantum-like paradigm, generalized quantum paradigm, or quantum structure paradigm that information processing by complex systems such as the brain can be mathematically described in the framework of quantum information and quantum probability theory. This model uses quantum mechanics only as an analogy and does not propose that quantum mechanics is the physical mechanism by which it operates. For example, quantum cognition proposes that some decisions can be analyzed as if there is interference between two alternatives, but it is not a physical quantum interference effect. Practical problems. The main theoretical argument against the quantum mind hypothesis is the assertion that quantum states in the brain would lose coherency before they reached a scale where they could be useful for neural processing. This supposition was elaborated by Max Tegmark. His calculations indicate that quantum systems in the brain decohere at sub-picosecond timescales. No response by a brain has shown computational results or reactions on this fast of a timescale. Typical reactions are on the order of milliseconds, trillions of times longer than sub-picosecond timescales. Daniel Dennett uses an experimental result in support of his multiple drafts model of an optical illusion that happens on a timescale of less than a second or so. In this experiment, two different colored lights, with an angular separation of a few degrees at the eye, are flashed in succession. If the interval between the flashes is less than a second or so, the first light that is flashed appears to move across to the position of the second light. Furthermore, the light seems to change color as it moves across the visual field. A green light will appear to turn red as it seems to move across to the position of a red light. Dennett asks how we could see the light change color before the second light is observed. Velmans argues that the cutaneous rabbit illusion, another illusion that happens in about a second, demonstrates that there is a delay while modeling occurs in the brain, and that this delay was discovered by Libet. These slow illusions that happen at times of less than a second do not support a proposal that the brain functions on the picosecond timescale. Penrose says, "The problem with trying to use quantum mechanics in the action of the brain is that if it were a matter of quantum nerve signals, these nerve signals would disturb the rest of the material in the brain, to the extent that the quantum coherence would get lost very quickly. You couldn't even attempt to build a quantum computer out of ordinary nerve signals because they're just too big and in an environment that's too disorganized. Ordinary nerve signals have to be treated classically. But if you go down to the level of the microtubules, then there's an extremely good chance that you can get quantum level activity inside them. For my picture, I need this quantum level activity in the microtubules. The activity has to be a large-scale thing that goes not just from one microtubule to the next, but from one nerve cell to the next, across large areas of the brain. We need some kind of coherent activity of a quantum nature, which is weakly coupled to the computational activity that Hameroff argues is taking place along the microtubules. There are various avenues of attack. One is directly on the physics, on quantum theory, and there are certain experiments that people are beginning to perform and various schemes for a modification of quantum mechanics. I don't think the experiments are sensitive enough yet to test many of these specific ideas. One could imagine experiments that might test these things, but they'd be very hard to perform. Penrose also said in an interview, "Whatever consciousness is, it must be beyond computable physics. It's not that consciousness depends on quantum mechanics, it's that it depends on where our current theories of quantum mechanics go wrong. It's to do with a theory that we don't know yet. A demonstration of a quantum effect in the brain has to explain this problem or explain why it is not relevant, or that the brain somehow circumvents the problem of the loss of quantum coherency at body temperature. As Penrose proposes, it may require a new type of physical theory, something we don't know yet." Ethical problems. Deepak Chopra has referred a quantum soul existing apart from the body, human access to a field of infinite possibilities, and other quantum mysticism topics such as quantum healing or quantum effects of consciousness. Seeing the human body as being undergirded by a quantum mechanical body composed not of matter but of energy and information, he believes that human aging is fluid and changeable. It can speed up, slow down, stop for a time, and even reverse itself, as determined by one's state of mind. Robert Carroll states that Chopra attempts to integrate Ayurveda with quantum mechanics to justify his teachings. Chopra argues that what he calls quantum healing cures any manner of ailments, including cancer, through effects that he claims are based on the same principles as quantum mechanics. This has led physicists to object to his use of the term quantum in reference to medical conditions and the human body. Chopra said, "I think quantum theory has a lot of things to say about the observer effect, about non-locality, about correlations. So I think there's a school of physicists who believe that consciousness has to be equated, or at least brought into the equation in understanding quantum mechanics." On the other hand, he also claims that quantum effects are just a metaphor. Just like an electron or a photon is an indivisible unit of information and energy, a thought is an indivisible unit of consciousness. In his book Quantum Healing, Chopra stated the conclusion that quantum entanglement links everything in the universe, and therefore it must create consciousness. According to Daniel Dennett, on this topic, everybody's an expert, but they think that they have a particular personal authority about the nature of their own conscious experiences that can trump any hypothesis they find unacceptable. While quantum effects are significant in the physiology of the brain, critics of quantum mind hypotheses challenge whether the effects of known or speculated quantum phenomena in biology scale up to have significance in neuronal computation, much less the emergence of consciousness as phenomenon. Daniel Dennett said, "Quantum effects are there in your car, your watch, and your computer. But most things, most macroscopic objects are, as it were, oblivious to quantum effects. They don't amplify them. They don't hinge on them." The many minds interpretation of quantum mechanics extends the many worlds interpretation by proposing that the distinction between worlds should be made at the level of the mind of an individual observer. The concept was first introduced in 1970 by H. Dieter Zeh as a variant of the Hugh Everett interpretation in connection with quantum decoherence, and later, in 1981, explicitly called a many or multi-consciousness interpretation. The name many minds interpretation was first used by David Albert and Barry Lower in 1988. Interpretations of quantum mechanics. The various interpretations of quantum mechanics typically involve explaining the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, or to create a physical picture of the theory. While the mathematical structure has a strong foundation, there is still much debate about the physical and philosophical interpretation of the theory. These interpretations aim to tackle various concepts such as evolution of the state of a quantum system, given by the wave function, typically through the use of the Schrödinger equation. This concept is almost universally accepted and is rarely put to debate. The measurement problem, which relates to what is called wave function, the collapse of a quantum state into a definite measurement, i.e. a specific eigenstate of the wave function. The debate on whether this collapse actually occurs is a central problem in interpreting quantum mechanics. The standard solution to the measurement problem is the orthodox or Copenhagen interpretation, which claims that the wave function collapses as the result of a measurement by an observer or apparatus external to the quantum system. An alternative interpretation, the many worlds interpretation, was first described by Hugh Everett in 1957, where it was called the relative state interpretation. The name many worlds was coined by Bryce Seligman DeWitt starting in the 1960s and finalized in the 1970s. His formalism of quantum mechanics denied that a measurement requires a wave collapse, instead suggesting that all that is truly necessary of a measurement is that a quantum connection is formed between the particle, the measuring device, and the observer. The many worlds interpretation. In the original relative state formulation, Everett proposed that there is one universal wave function that describes the objective reality of the whole universe. He stated that when subsystems interact, the total system becomes a superposition of these subsystems. This includes observers and measurement systems, which become part of one universal state, the wave function, that is always described via the Schrödinger equation, or its relativistic alternative. That is, the states of the subsystems that interacted become entangled in such a way that any definition of one must necessarily involve the other. Thus, each subsystem's state can only be described relative to each subsystem with which it interacts, hence the name relative state. Everett suggested that the universe is actually indeterminate as a whole. For example, consider an observer measuring some particle that starts in an undetermined state as both spin-up and spin-down, that is a superposition of both possibilities. When an observer measures that particle spin, however, it always registers as either up or down. The problem of how to understand this sudden shift from both up and down to either up or down is called the measurement problem. According to the many worlds interpretation, the act of measurement forced a splitting of the universe into two states, one spin up and the other spin down, and the two branches that extend from those two subsequently independent states. One branch measures up, the other measures down. Looking at the instrument informs the observer which branch he is on, but the system itself is indeterminate at this and, by logical extension, presumably any higher level. The worlds in the many worlds theory is then just the complete measurement history up until and during the measurement in question, where splitting happens. These worlds each describe a different state of the universal wave function and cannot communicate. There is no collapse of the wave function into one state or another, but rather an observer finds itself in the world leading up to what measurement it has made and is unaware of the other possibilities that are equally real. The many minds interpretation. The many minds interpretation of quantum theory is many worlds with the distinction between worlds constructed at the level of the individual observer. Rather than the worlds that branch, it is the observer's mind that branches. The problem with this interpretation is that it implies the observer must be in a superposition with herself, and that seems strange. In their 1988 paper, Albert and Lower argued that the mind of an observer cannot be in an indefinite state because an observer must answer the question about which state of a system he has observed with complete certainty. If the observer's mind were in a superposition of states, then it could not attain such certainty. To overcome this contradiction, they suggest that a mind must always be in a definite state, and only the bodies of the minds are in a superposition. Accordingly, when an observer measures a quantum system and becomes entangled with it, the result is a larger quantum system. In regards to each possibility within this greater wave function, a mental state of the brain corresponds. Ultimately, only one of these mental states is experienced, leading the others to branch off and become inaccessible, albeit real. In this way, every sentient being possesses an infinity of minds, whose prevalence correspond to the amplitude of the wave function. As an observer checks a measurement, the probability of realizing a specific measurement directly correlates to the number of minds they have where they see that measurement. It is in this way that the probabilistic nature of quantum measurements are obtained by the many minds interpretation. Quantum non-locality in the many minds interpretation. The body remains in an indeterminate state while the minds picks a stochastic result. Consider an experiment that measures the polarization of two photons. When the photon is created, it has an indeterminate polarization. If a stream of these photons is passed through a polarization filter, 50% of the light is passed through. This corresponds to each photon having a 50% chance of aligning with the filter and thus passing or being misaligned by 90 degrees relative to the polarization filter and being absorbed. Quantum mechanically, this means the photon is in a superposition of states where it is either passed or absorbed. Now, consider the inclusion of another photon and polarization detector. Now, the photons are created in such a way that they are entangled. That is, when one photon takes on a polarization state, the other photon will always behave as if it has the same polarization. For simplicity, take the second filter to either be perfectly aligned with the first or to be perfectly misaligned, 90-degree difference in angle, such that it is absorbed. If the detectors are aligned, both photons are passed, i.e. they are said to agree. If they are misaligned, only the first passes and the second is absorbed, now they disagree. Thus, the entanglement causes perfect correlations between the two measurements regardless of separation distance, making the interaction non-local. This sort of experiment is further explained in Tim Maudlin's quantum non-locality and relativity and can be related to Bell test experiments. Now, consider the analysis of this experiment from the many minds point of view. No sentient observer. Consider the case where there is no sentient observer, i.e. no mind present to observe the experiment. In this case, the detector will be in an indefinite state. The photon is both passed and absorbed and will remain in this state. The correlations are withheld in that none of the possible minds, or wave function states, correspond to non-correlated results. One sentient observer. Now expand the situation to have one sentient being observing the device. Now, they too enter the indefinite state. Their eyes, body, and brain are seeing both spins at the same time. The mind, however, stochastically chooses one of the directions, and that is what the mind sees. When this observer views the second detector, their body will see both results. Their mind will choose the result that agrees with the first detector, and the observer will see the expected results. However, the observer's mind seeing one result does not directly affect the distant state. There is just no wave function in which the expected correlations do not exist. The true correlation only happens when they actually view the second detector. Two sentient observers. When two people look at two different detectors that scan entangled particles, both observers will enter an indefinite state, as with one observer. These results need not agree. The second observer's mind does not have to have results that correlate with the first's. When one observer tells the results to the second observer, their two minds cannot communicate and thus will only interact with the other's body, which is still indefinite. When the second observer responds, his body will respond with whatever result agrees with the first observer's mind. This means that both observers' minds will be in a state of the wave function that always get the expected results, but individually their results could be different. Non-locality of the many minds interpretation. As we have thus seen, any correlations seen in the wave function of each observer's minds are only concrete after interaction between the different polarizers. The correlations on the level of individual minds correspond to the appearance of quantum non-locality, or equivalently, violation of Bell's inequality. So the many world is non-local, or it cannot explain EPR-GHZ correlations. Support. There is currently no empirical evidence for the many minds interpretation. However, there are theories that do not discredit the many minds interpretation. In light of Bell's analysis of the consequences of quantum non-locality, empirical evidence is needed to avoid inventing novel fundamental concepts, hidden variables. Two different solutions of the measurement problem then appear conceivable. Consciousness causes collapse or Everett's relative state interpretation. In both cases, a suitably modified psychophysical parallelism can be reestablished. If neural processes can be described and analyzed, then some experiments could potentially be created to test whether affecting neural processes can have an effect on a quantum system. Speculation about the details of this awareness-local physical system coupling on a purely theoretical basis could occur. However, experimentally searching for them through neurological and psychological studies would be ideal. Objections. Nothing within quantum theory itself requires each possibility within a wave function to complement a mental state. As all physical states, i.e. brain states, are quantum states, their associated mental states should be also. Nonetheless, it is not what one experiences within physical reality. Albert and Lower argue that the mind must be intrinsically different than the physical reality, as described by quantum theory. Thereby, they reject type identity physicalism in favor of a non-reductive stance. However, Lockwood saves materialism through the notion of supervenience of the mental on the physical. Nonetheless, the many minds interpretation does not solve the mindless Hulk's problem as a problem of supervenience. Mental states do not supervene on brain states, as a given brain state is compatible with different configurations of mental states. Another serious objection is that workers in no-collapse interpretations have produced no more than elementary models based on the definite existence of specific measuring devices. They have assumed, for example, that the Hilbert space of the universe splits naturally into a tensor product structure compatible with the measurement under consideration. They have also assumed, even when describing the behavior of macroscopic objects, that it is appropriate to employ models in which only a few dimensions of Hilbert space are used to describe all the relevant behavior. Furthermore, as the many minds interpretation is corroborated by our experience of physical reality, a notion of many unseen worlds and its compatibility with other physical theories, i.e. the principle of the conservation of mass, is difficult to reconcile. According to Schrödinger's equation, the mass energy of the combined observed system and measurement apparatus is the same before and after. However, with every measurement process, i.e. splitting, the total mass energy would seemingly increase. Peter J. Lewis argues that the many minds interpretation of quantum mechanics has absurd implications for agents facing life or death decisions. In general, the many minds theory holds that a conscious being who observes the outcome of a random zero-sum experiment will evolve into two successors in different observer states, each of whom observes one of the possible outcomes. Moreover, the theory advises one to favor choices in such situations in proportion to the probability that they will bring good results to one's various successors. But in a life or death case, like an observer getting into the box with Schrödinger's cat, the observer will only have one successor, since one of the outcomes will ensure the observer's death. So it seems that the many minds interpretation advises one to get in the box with the cat, since it is certain that one's only successor will emerge unharmed. See also quantum suicide and immortality. Finally, it supposes that there is some physical distinction between a conscious observer and a non-conscious measuring device, so it seems to require eliminating the strong Church-Turing hypothesis or postulating a physical model for consciousness. Quantum suicide and immortality. Immortality is the concept of eternal life and permanent resistance to death from natural causes. Some species possess biological immortality due to an apparent lack of the Hayflick limit. From at least the time of the ancient Mesopotamians, there has been a conviction that gods may be physically immortal, and that this is also a state that the gods at times offer humans. In Christianity, the conviction that God may offer physical immortality with the resurrection of the flesh at the end of time has traditionally been at the center of its beliefs. What form an unending human life would take, or whether an immaterial soul exists and possesses immortality, has been a major point of focus of religion, as well as the subject of speculation and debate. In religious contexts, immortality is often stated to be one of the promises of divinities to human beings who perform virtue or follow divine law. Some scientists, futurists, and philosophers have theorized about the immortality of the human body, with some suggesting that human immortality may be achievable in the first few decades of the 21st century with the help of certain speculative technologies such as mind uploading, digital immortality. Scientific. Life extension technologies claim to be developing a path to complete rejuvenation. Cryonics holds out the hope that the dead can be revived in the future, following sufficient medical advancements. While, as shown with creatures such as Hydra and planarian worms, it is indeed possible for a creature to be biologically immortal, these are animals which are physiologically very different from humans, and it is not known if something comparable will ever be possible for humans. Religious. Immortality in religion refers usually to either the belief in physical immortality or a more spiritual afterlife. In traditions such as ancient Egyptian beliefs, Mesopotamian beliefs, and ancient Greek beliefs, the immortal gods consequently were considered to have physical bodies. In Mesopotamian and Greek religion, the gods also made certain men and women physically immortal, whereas in Christianity, many believe that all true believers will be resurrected to physical immortality. Similar beliefs that physical immortality is possible are held by Rastafarians or rebirthers. Physical immortality. Physical immortality is a state of life that allows a person to avoid death and maintain conscious thought. It can mean the unending existence of a person from a physical source other than organic life, such as a computer. Pursuit of physical immortality before the advent of modern science included alchemists, who sought to create the Philosopher's Stone, and various cultures' legends such as the Fountain of Youth or the Peaches of Immortality, inspiring attempts at discovering an elixir of life. Modern scientific trends such as cryonics, digital immortality, breakthroughs in rejuvenation, or predictions of an impending technological singularity to achieve genuine human physical immortality must still overcome all causes of death to succeed. Causes of death. There are three main causes of death: natural aging, disease, and injury. Such issues can be resolved with the solutions provided in research to any end, providing such alternate theories at present that require unification. Aging. Aubrey de Grey, a leading researcher in the field, defines aging as a collection of cumulative changes to the molecular and cellular structure of an adult organism, which result in essential metabolic processes, but which also, once they progress far enough, increasingly disrupt metabolism, resulting in pathology and death. The current causes of aging in humans are cell loss without replacement, DNA damage, oncogenic nuclear mutations and epimutations, cell senescence, mitochondrial mutations, lysosomal aggregates, extracellular aggregates, random extracellular cross-linking, immune system decline, and endocrine changes. Eliminating aging would require finding a solution to each of these causes, a program de Grey calls engineered negligible senescence. There is also a huge body of knowledge indicating that change is characterized by the loss of molecular fidelity. Disease. Disease is theoretically surmountable by technology. In short, it is an abnormal condition affecting the body of an organism, something the body should not typically have to deal with its natural makeup. Human understanding of genetics is leading to cures and treatments for a myriad of previously incurable diseases. The mechanisms by which other diseases do damage are becoming better understood. Sophisticated methods of detecting diseases early are being developed. Preventative medicine is becoming better understood. Neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's may soon be curable with the use of stem cells. Breakthroughs in cell biology and telomere research are leading to treatments for cancer. Vaccines are being researched for AIDS and tuberculosis. Genes associated with type 1 diabetes and certain types of cancer have been discovered, allowing for new therapies to be developed. Artificial devices attached directly to the nervous system may restore sight to the blind. Drugs are being developed to treat a myriad of other diseases and ailments. There has been a push recently to classify aging as a disease. Citation needed. Trauma. Physical trauma would remain as a threat to perpetual physical life, as an otherwise immortal person would still be subject to unforeseen accidents or catastrophes. The speed and quality of paramedic response remains a determining factor in surviving severe trauma. A body that could automatically repair itself from severe trauma, such as speculated uses for nanotechnology, would mitigate this factor. The brain cannot be risked to trauma, if a continuous physical life is to be maintained. This aversion to trauma risk to the brain would naturally result in significant behavioral changes that would render physical immortality undesirable for some people. Environmental change. Organisms otherwise unaffected by these causes of death would still face the problem of obtaining sustenance, whether from currently available agricultural processes or from hypothetical future technological processes, in the face of changing availability of suitable resources as environmental conditions change. After avoiding aging, disease, and trauma, death through resource limitation is still possible, such as hypoxia or starvation. If there is no limitation on the degree of gradual mitigation of risk, then it is possible that the cumulative probability of death over an infinite horizon is less than certainty, even when the risk of fatal trauma in any finite period is greater than zero. Mathematically, this is an aspect of achieving actuarial escape velocity. Biological immortality. Biological immortality is an absence of aging. Specifically, it is the absence of a sustained increase in rate of mortality as a function of chronological age. A cell or organism that does not experience aging or ceases to age at some point is biologically immortal. Biologists have chosen the word immortal to designate cells that are not limited by the Hayflick limit, where cells no longer divide because of DNA damage or shortened telomeres. The first and still most widely used immortal cell line is HeLa, developed from cells taken from the malignant cervical tumor of Henrietta Lacks without her consent in 1951. Prior to the 1961 work of Leonard Hayflick, there was the erroneous belief fostered by Alexis Carrel that all normal somatic cells are immortal. By preventing cells from reaching senescence, one can achieve biological immortality. Telomeres, a cap at the end of DNA, are thought to be the cause of cell aging. Every time a cell divides, the telomere becomes a bit shorter. When it is finally worn down, the cell is unable to split and dies. Telomerase is an enzyme which rebuilds the telomeres in stem cells and cancer cells, allowing them to replicate an infinite number of times. No definitive work has yet demonstrated that telomerase can be used in human somatic cells to prevent healthy tissues from aging. On the other hand, scientists hope to be able to grow organs with the help of stem cells, allowing organ transplants without the risk of rejection, another step in extending human life expectancy. These technologies are the subject of ongoing research and are not yet realized. Biologically immortal species. See also, list of longest living organisms. Life defined as biologically immortal is still susceptible to causes of death besides aging, including disease and trauma, as defined above. Notable immortal species include bacteria. Bacteria reproduce through binary fission. A parent bacterium splits itself into two identical daughter cells, which eventually then split themselves in half. This process repeats, thus making the bacterium essentially immortal. A 2005 PLOS biology paper suggests that after each division, the daughter cells can be identified as the older and the younger, and the older is slightly smaller, weaker, and more likely to die than the younger. Turritopsis dohrnii, a jellyfish, phylum Cnidaria, class Hydrozoa, order Anthoathecata, after becoming a sexually mature adult, can transform itself back into a polyp using the cell conversion process of transdifferentiation. Turritopsis dohrnii repeats this cycle, meaning that it may have an indefinite lifespan. Its immortal adaptation has allowed it to spread from its original habitat in the Caribbean to all over the world. Hydra is a genus belonging to the phylum Cnidaria, the class Hydrozoa, and the order Anthomedusae. They are simple freshwater predatory animals possessing radial symmetry. Evolution of aging. As the existence of biologically immortal species demonstrates, there is no thermodynamic necessity for senescence. A defining feature of life is that it takes in free energy from the environment and unloads its entropy as waste. Living systems can even build themselves up from seed and routinely repair themselves. Aging is therefore presumed to be a byproduct of evolution, but why mortality should be selected for remains a subject of research and debate. Programmed cell death and the telomere end replication problem are found even in the earliest and simplest of organisms. This may be a trade-off between selecting for cancer and selecting for aging. Modern theories on the evolution of aging include the following. Mutation accumulation is a theory formulated by Peter Medawar in 1952 to explain how evolution would select for aging. Essentially, aging is never selected against, as organisms have offspring before the mortal mutations surface in an individual. Antagonistic pleiotropy is a theory proposed as an alternative by George C. Williams, a critic of Medawar, in 1957. In antagonistic pleiotropy, genes carry effects that are both beneficial and detrimental. In essence, this refers to genes that offer benefits early in life, but exact a cost later on, i.e. decline and death. The disposable soma theory was proposed in 1977 by Thomas Kirkwood, which states that an individual body must allocate energy for metabolism, reproduction, and maintenance, and must compromise when there is food scarcity. Compromise in allocating energy to the repair function is what causes the body gradually to deteriorate with age, according to Kirkwood. Immortality of the germline. Individual organisms ordinarily age and die, while the germlines which connect successive generations are potentially immortal. The basis for this difference is a fundamental problem in biology. The Russian biologist and historian Juras A. Medvedev considered that the accuracy of genome replicative and other synthetic systems alone cannot explain the immortality of germlines. Rather, Medvedev thought that known features of the biochemistry and genetics of sexual reproduction indicate the presence of unique information maintenance and restoration processes at the different stages of gametogenesis. In particular, Medvedev considered that the most important opportunities for information maintenance of germ cells are created by recombination during meiosis and DNA repair. He saw these as processes within the germ cells that were capable of restoring the integrity of DNA and chromosomes from the types of damage that cause irreversible aging in somatic cells. Prospects for human biological immortality. Life-extending substances. Scientists believe that boosting the amount or proportion of telomerase in the body, a naturally forming enzyme that helps maintain the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes, could prevent cells from dying and so may ultimately lead to extended, healthier lifespans. A team of researchers at the Spanish National Cancer Center, Madrid, tested the hypothesis on mice. It was found that those mice which were genetically engineered to produce 10 times the normal levels of telomerase lived 50% longer than normal mice. In normal circumstances, without the presence of telomerase, if a cell divides repeatedly, at some point all the progeny will reach their Hayflick limit. With the presence of telomerase, each dividing cell can replace the lost bit of DNA, and any single cell can then divide unbounded. While this unbounded growth property has excited many researchers, caution is warranted in exploiting this property, as exactly this same unbounded growth is a crucial step in enabling cancerous growth. If an organism can replicate its body cells faster, then it would theoretically stop aging. Embryonic stem cells express telomerase, which allows them to divide repeatedly and form the individual. In adults, telomerase is highly expressed in cells that need to divide regularly, e.g., in the immune system, whereas most somatic cells express it only at very low levels in a cell cycle-dependent manner. Technological immortality, biological machines, and swallowing the doctor. Technological immortality may be possible by scientific advances in a variety of fields: nanotechnology, emergency room procedures, genetics, biological engineering, regenerative medicine, microbiology, etc. Contemporary lifespans in the advanced industrial societies are already markedly longer than those of the past because of better nutrition, availability of healthcare, standard of living, and biomedical scientific advances. Citation needed. Technological immortality predicts further progress for the same reasons over the near term. An important aspect of current scientific thinking about immortality is that some combination of human cloning, cryonics, or nanotechnology will play an essential role in extreme life extension. Robert Freitas, a nanorobotics theorist, suggests tiny medical nanorobots could be created to go through human bloodstreams, find dangerous things like cancer cells and bacteria, and destroy them. Freitas anticipates that gene therapies and nanotechnology will eventually make the human body effectively self-sustainable and capable of living indefinitely in empty space, short of severe brain trauma. This supports the theory that we will be able to continually create biological or synthetic replacement parts to replace damaged or dying ones. Future advances in nanomedicine could give rise to life extension through the repair of many processes thought to be responsible for aging. Eric Drexler, one of the founders of nanotechnology, postulated cell repair devices, including ones operating within cells and using as yet hypothetical biological machines, in his 1986 book Engines of Creation. Raymond Kurzweil, a futurist and transhumanist, stated in his book The Singularity is Near that he believes that advanced medical nanorobotics could completely remedy the effects of aging by 2030. According to Richard Feynman, it was his former graduate student and collaborator Albert Hibbs who originally suggested to him, circa 1959, the idea of a medical use for Feynman's theoretical micromachines, see biological machine. Hibbs suggested that certain repair machines might one day be reduced in size to the point that it would, in theory, be possible to, as Feynman put it, swallow the doctor. The idea was incorporated into Feynman's 1959 essay, There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom. Cryonics. Cryonics, the practice of preserving organisms, either intact specimens or only their brains, for possible future revival by storing them at cryogenic temperatures where metabolism and decay are almost completely stopped, can be used to pause for those who believe that life extension technologies will not develop sufficiently within their lifetime. Ideally, cryonics would allow clinically dead people to be brought back in the future after cures to the patient's diseases have been discovered and aging is reversible. Modern cryonics procedures use a process called vitrification, which creates a glass-like state rather than freezing as the body is brought to low temperatures. This process reduces the risk of ice crystals damaging the cell structure, which would be especially detrimental to cell structures in the brain, as their minute adjustment evokes the individual's mind. Mind-to-computer uploading. One idea that has been advanced involves uploading an individual's habits and memories via a direct mind-computer interface. The individual's memory may be loaded to a computer or to a new organic body. Extropian futurists like Moravec and Kurzweil have proposed that, thanks to exponentially growing computing power, it will someday be possible to upload human consciousness onto a computer system and exist indefinitely in a virtual environment. This could be accomplished via advanced cybernetics, where computer hardware would initially be installed in the brain to help sort memory or accelerate thought processes. Components would be added gradually until the person's entire brain functions were handled by artificial devices, avoiding sharp transitions that would lead to issues of identity, thus running the risk of the person to be declared dead and thus not be a legitimate owner of his or her property. After this point, the human body could be treated as an optional accessory, and the program implementing the person could be transferred to any sufficiently powerful computer. Another possible mechanism for mind upload is to perform a detailed scan of an individual's original, organic brain and simulate the entire structure in a computer. What level of detail such scans and simulations would need to achieve to emulate awareness, and whether the scanning process would destroy the brain, is still to be determined. It is suggested that achieving immortality through this mechanism would require specific consideration to be given to the role of consciousness in the functions of the mind. An uploaded mind would only be a copy of the original mind, and not the conscious mind of the living entity associated in such a transfer. Without a simultaneous upload of consciousness, the original living entity remains mortal, thus not achieving true immortality. Research on neural correlates of consciousness is yet inconclusive on this issue. Whatever the route to mind upload, Persons in this state could then be considered essentially immortal, short of loss or traumatic destruction of the machines that maintain them. Cybernetics. Transforming a human into a cyborg can include brain implants or extracting a human processing unit and placing it in a robotic life support system. Even replacing biological organs with robotic ones could increase lifespan, e.g., pacemakers, and depending on the definition, many technological upgrades to the body, like genetic modifications or the addition of nanobots, would qualify an individual as a cyborg. Some people believe that such modifications would make one impervious to aging and disease, and theoretically immortal unless killed or destroyed. Digital immortality. Religious views. As late as 1952, the editorial staff of the Syntopicon found in their compilation of the great books of the Western world that the philosophical issue concerning immortality cannot be separated from issues concerning the existence and nature of man's soul. Thus, the vast majority of speculation on immortality before the 21st century was regarding the nature of the afterlife. Abrahamic religion. The viewpoints of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism regarding the concept of immortality diverge as each faith system encapsulates unique theological interpretations and doctrines on the enduring human nature, soul, or spirit. Christianity. Adam and Eve condemned to mortality. Hans Holbein the Younger, Danse Macabre, 16th century. A Christian theology holds that Adam and Eve lost physical immortality for themselves and all their descendants through the fall, although this initial imperishability of the bodily frame of man was a preternatural condition. Christians who profess the Nicene Creed believe that every dead person, whether they believed in Christ or not, will be resurrected from the dead at the second coming. This belief is known as universal resurrection. Paul the Apostle, in following his past life as a Pharisee, a Jewish social movement that held to a future physical resurrection, proclaims an amalgamated view of resurrected believers where both the physical and the spiritual are rebuilt in the likeness of post-resurrection Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body. This thought mirrors Paul's depiction of believers having been buried therefore with him, that is, Christ by baptism into death. N.T. Wright, a theologian and former Bishop of Durham, has said many people forget the physical aspect of what Jesus promised. He told Time, Jesus' resurrection marks the beginning of a restoration that he will complete upon his return. Part of this will be the resurrection of all the dead who will awake, be embodied, and participate in the renewal. Wright says John Polkinghorne, a physicist and a priest, has put it this way: God will download our software onto his hardware until the time he gives us new hardware to run the software again for ourselves. That gets to two things nicely: that the period after death, the intermediate state, is a period when we are in God's presence but not active in our own bodies, and also that the more important transformation will be when we are again embodied and administering Christ's kingdom. This kingdom will consist of heaven and earth, joined together in a new creation, he said. Christian apocrypha include immortal human figures such as Cartaphilus, who were cursed with physical immortality for various transgressions against Christ during the Passion. The medieval Waldensians believed in the immortality of the soul. 54 leaders of sects such as John Eskil and John Rowe taught followers that physical immortality was possible. Many patristic writers have connected the immortal rational soul to the image of God found in Genesis 1 verse 26. Among them is Athanasius of Alexandria and Clement of Alexandria, who say that the immortal rational soul itself is the image of God. Even early Christian liturgies exhibit this connection between the immortal rational soul and the creation of humanity in the image of God. Islam. Every soul will taste death, and you will receive your full reward on the Judgment Day. Islamic beliefs include the concept of spiritual immortality. Following death, Islam teaches that a person will be judged consistent with their beliefs and actions and will embark unto their everlasting place. The Muslim who holds the 5 pillars of Islam will make an entrance into the Jannah, where they will inhabit eternally. In contrast, the Kafir goes to hell. But give glad tidings to those who believe and work righteousness, that their portion is gardens, beneath which rivers flow. Every time they are fed with fruits therefrom, they say, Why, this is what we were fed with before. For they are given things in similitude, and they have therein companions pure and holy, and they abide therein forever. Angels in Islam are reckoned as immortals from the perspective of Islam, but most people believe that the angels will die and that the angel of death will die, but there is no clear text concerning this. Rather, there are texts which may indicate this, and there is the well-known hadith, narration about the trumpet, which is a munkar hadith, rejected report. Alternatively, jinn have a long lifespan between 1,000 and 1,500. Qadr, a prominent figure in Sufism, is given immortality, but an exception. Jesus in Islam was summoned to the sky by Allah's sanction to preserve him from the cross, 60, and endow him with long life until the advent of the Dajjal. Dajjal is, additionally, given a long life. Jesus Christ dispatches the Dajjal as he stays after 40 days. One like a year, one like a month, one like a week, and the rest of his days like normal days. The Quran states that it is the ultimate fate of all life, including humans, to die eventually. Judaism. The traditional concept of an immaterial and immortal soul distinct from the body was not found in Judaism before the Babylonian exile, but developed as a result of interaction with Persian and Hellenistic philosophies. Accordingly, the Hebrew word nephesh, although translated as soul in some older English language Bibles, actually has a meaning closer to living being. Nephesh was rendered in the Septuagint as the Greek word for soul, the only Hebrew word traditionally translated soul in English language Bibles refers to a living, breathing conscious body, rather than to an immortal soul. In the New Testament, the Greek word traditionally translated soul has substantially the same meaning as the Hebrew, without reference to an immortal soul. Soul may refer either to the whole person, the self, as in 3,000 souls were converted in Acts 2 verse 41. The Hebrew Bible speaks about Sheol, originally a synonym of the grave, the repository of the dead, or the cessation of existence, until the resurrection of the dead. This doctrine of resurrection is mentioned explicitly only in Daniel 12 verses 1 to 4, although it may be implied in several other texts. New theories arose concerning Sheol during the intertestamental period. The views about immortality in Judaism is perhaps best exemplified by the various references to this in Second Temple period. The concept of resurrection of the physical body is found in 2 Maccabees, according to which it will happen through recreation of the flesh. Resurrection of the dead is specified in detail in the extra-canonical books of Enoch and in Apocalypse of Baruch. According to the British scholar in Ancient Judaism P.R. Davies, there is little or no clear reference either to immortality or to resurrection from the dead in the Dead Sea Scrolls texts. Both Josephus and the New Testament record that the Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife, but the sources vary on the beliefs of the Pharisees. The New Testament claims that the Pharisees believed in the resurrection, but does not specify whether this included the flesh or not. According to Josephus, who himself was a Pharisee, the Pharisees held that only the soul was immortal and the souls of good people will be reincarnated and pass into other bodies, while the souls of the wicked will suffer eternal punishment. The Book of Jubilees seems to refer to the resurrection of the soul only, or to a more general idea of an immortal soul. Rabbinic Judaism believes that the righteous dead will be resurrected in the Messianic age, with the coming of the Messiah. They will then be granted immortality in a perfect world. The wicked dead, on the other hand, will not be resurrected at all. This is not the only Jewish belief about the afterlife. The Tanakh is not specific about the afterlife, so there are wide differences in views and explanations among believers. Indian religions. The perspectives on immortality within Hinduism and Buddhism exhibit nuanced differences, with each spiritual tradition offering distinctive theological interpretations and doctrines concerning the eternal essence of the human soul or consciousness. Hinduism. See also Paranjivi and Naraka Hinduism, representation of a soul undergoing punarjanma. Hindus believe in an immortal soul which is reincarnated after death. According to Hinduism, people repeat a process of life, death, and rebirth in a cycle called samsara. If they live their life well, their karma improves and their station in the next life will be higher, and conversely lower if they live their life poorly. After many lifetimes of perfecting its karma, the soul is freed from the cycle and lives in perpetual bliss. There is no place of eternal torment in Hinduism, although if a soul consistently lives very evil lives, it could work its way down to the very bottom of the cycle. There are explicit renderings in the Upanishads alluding to a physically immortal state brought about by purification and sublimation of the 5 elements that make up the body. For example, in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, chapter 2, verse 12, it is stated when earth, water, fire, air, and sky arise, that is to say, when the 5 attributes of the elements, mentioned in the books on yoga, become manifest, then the yogi's body becomes purified by the fire of yoga and he is free from illness, old age, and death. Another view of immortality is traced to the Vedic tradition by the interpretation of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, that man indeed whom these contacts do not disturb, who is even-minded in pleasure and pain, steadfast he is fit for immortality, O best of men. To Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the verse means, once a man has become established in the understanding of the permanent reality of life, his mind rises above the influence of pleasure and pain. Such an unshakable man passes beyond the influence of death, and in the permanent phase of life, he attains eternal life. A man established in the understanding of the unlimited abundance of absolute existence is naturally free from existence of the relative order. This is what gives him the status of immortal life. An Indian Tamil saint known as Valor claimed to have achieved immortality before disappearing forever from a locked room in 1874. Buddhism. One of the 3 marks of existence in Buddhism is anatta, non-self. This teaching states that the body does not have an eternal soul, but is composed of 5 skandhas or aggregates. Additionally, another mark of existence is impermanence, also called anicca, which runs directly counter to concepts of immortality or permanence. According to one Tibetan Buddhist teaching, Dzogchen, individuals can transform the physical body into an immortal body of light called the rainbow body. Ancient religions. Ancient Greek religion. Immortality in ancient Greek religion originally always included an eternal union of body and soul, as can be seen in Homer, Hesiod, and various other ancient texts. The soul was considered to have an eternal existence in Hades, but without the body, the soul was considered dead. Although almost everybody had nothing to look forward to but an eternal existence as a disembodied dead soul, a number of men and women were considered to have gained physical immortality and been brought to live forever in either Elysium, the islands of the blessed, heaven, the ocean, or literally right under the ground. Among those humans made immortal were Amphiaraos, Ganymede, Ino, Iphigenia, Menelaus, Peleus, and a great number of those who fought in the Trojan and Theban wars. Asclepius was killed by Zeus, and by Apollo's request, was subsequently immortalized as a star. In ancient Greek religion, a number of men and women have been interpreted as being resurrected and made immortal. Achilles, after being killed, was snatched from his funeral pyre by his divine mother Thetis and brought to an immortal existence in either Lus, the Elysian plains, or the islands of the blessed. Memnon, who was killed by Achilles, seems to have received a similar fate. Alcmene, Castor, Heracles, and Melicertes are also among the figures interpreted to have been resurrected to physical immortality. According to Herodotus's histories, the 7th century BC sage Aristides of Proconnesus was first found dead, after which his body disappeared from a locked room. He would reappear alive years later. However, Greek attitudes towards resurrection were generally negative, and the idea of resurrection was considered neither desirable nor possible. For example, Asclepius was killed by Zeus for using herbs to resurrect the dead, but by his father Apollo's request, was subsequently immortalized as a star. Writing his lives of illustrious men, parallel lives, in the 1st century, the Middle Platonic philosopher Plutarch, in his chapter on Romulus, gave an account of the king's mysterious disappearance and subsequent deification, comparing it to Greek tales such as the physical immortalization of Alcmene and Aristes the Proconnesian, for they say Aristes died in a fuller's workshop, and his friends coming to look for him found his body vanished, and that some presently after, coming from abroad, said they met him traveling towards Croton. Plutarch openly scorned such beliefs held in ancient Greek religion, writing, "Many such improbabilities do your fabulous writers relate, deifying creatures naturally mortal." Likewise, he writes that while something within humans comes from the gods and returns to them after death, this happens only when it is most completely separated and set free from the body and becomes altogether pure, fleshless, and undefiled. The parallel between these traditional beliefs and the later belief in the resurrection of Jesus was not lost on early Christians, as Justin Martyr argued. When we say Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propose nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you consider sons of Zeus. The philosophical idea of an immortal soul was a belief first appearing with either Pharisaids or the Orphics, and most importantly advocated by Plato and his followers. This, however, never became the general norm in Hellenistic thought, as may be witnessed even into the Christian era, not least by the complaints of various philosophers over popular beliefs. Many, or perhaps most, traditional Greeks maintained the conviction that certain individuals were resurrected from the dead and made physically immortal, and that others could only look forward to an existence as disembodied and dead, though everlasting, souls. Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrians believe that on the 4th day after death, the human soul leaves the body and the body remains as an empty shell. Souls would go to either heaven or hell. These concepts of the afterlife in Zoroastrianism may have influenced Abrahamic religions. The Persian word for immortal is associated with the month Immerted, meaning deathless in Persian, in the Iranian calendar, near the end of July. The month of Immerted or Imeritat is celebrated in Persian culture as ancient Persians believed the angel of immortality won over the angel of death in this month. Philosophical religions. Taoism. It is repeatedly stated in the Lucier Tuancio that death is unavoidable. Henri Maspero noted that many scholarly works frame Taoism as a school of thought focused on the quest for immortality. Isabel Robinett asserts that Taoism is better understood as a way of life than as a religion, and that its adherents do not approach or view Taoism the way non-Taoist historians have done. In the Tractate of Actions and Their Retributions, a traditional teaching, spiritual immortality can be rewarded to people who do a certain amount of good deeds and live a simple, pure life. A list of good deeds and sins are tallied to determine whether or not a mortal is worthy. Spiritual immortality, in this definition, allows the soul to leave the earthly realms of afterlife and go to pure realms in the Taoist cosmology. Philosophical arguments for the immortality of the soul. Alcmaeon of Croton. Alcmaeon of Croton argued that the soul is continuously and ceaselessly in motion. The exact form of his argument is unclear, but it appears to have influenced Plato, Aristotle, and other later writers. Plato's Phaedo advances 4 arguments for the soul's immortality. The cyclical argument, or opposites argument, explains that forms are eternal and unchanging, and as the soul always brings life, then it must not die and is necessarily imperishable. As the body is mortal and is subject to physical death, the soul must be its indestructible opposite. Plato then suggests the analogy of fire and cold. If the form of cold is imperishable and fire, its opposite, was within close proximity, it would have to withdraw intact, as does the soul during death. This could be likened to the idea of the opposite charges of magnets. The theory of recollection explains that we possess some non-empirical knowledge, e.g., The form of equality at birth, implying the soul existed before birth to carry that knowledge. Another account of the theory is found in Plato's Meno, although in that case Socrates implies anamnesis, previous knowledge of everything, whereas he is not so bold in Phaedo. The affinity argument explains that invisible, immortal, and incorporeal things are different from visible, mortal, and corporeal things. Our soul is of the former, while our body is of the latter, so when our bodies die and decay, our soul will continue to live. The argument from form of life, or the final argument, explains that the forms, incorporeal and static entities, are the cause of all things in the world, and all things participate in forms. For example, beautiful things participate in the form of beauty, the number 4 participates in the form of the even, etc. The soul, by its very nature, participates in the form of life, which means the soul can never die. Plotinus. Plotinus offers a version of the argument that Kant calls the Achilles of rationalist psychology. Plotinus first argues that the soul is simple, then notes that a simple being cannot decompose. Many subsequent philosophers have argued both that the soul is simple and that it must be immortal. The tradition arguably culminates with Moses Mendelssohn's Phaedon. Metachites. Theodore Metachites argues that part of the soul's nature is to move itself, but that a given movement will cease only if what causes the movement is separated from the thing moved, an impossibility if they are one and the same. Avicenna. Avicenna argued for the distinctness of the soul and the body, and the incorruptibility of the former. Aquinas. The full argument for the immortality of the soul and Thomas Aquinas' elaboration of Aristotelian theory is found in question 75 of the first part of the Summa Theologica. Descartes. René Descartes endorses the claim that the soul is simple, and also that this entails that it cannot decompose. Descartes does not address the possibility that the soul might suddenly disappear. Leibniz. In early work, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz endorses a version of the argument from the simplicity of the soul to its immortality, but like his predecessors, he does not address the possibility that the soul might suddenly disappear. In his monadology, he advances a sophisticated novel argument for the immortality of monads. Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn's Phaedon is a defense of the simplicity and immortality of the soul. It is a series of 3 dialogues, revisiting the Platonic dialogue Phaedo, in which Socrates argues for the immortality of the soul in preparation for his own death. Many philosophers, including Plotinus, Descartes, and Leibniz, argue that the soul is simple, and that because simples cannot decompose, they must be immortal. In the Phaedon, Mendelssohn addresses gaps in earlier versions of this argument, an argument that Kant calls the Achilles of rationalist psychology. The Phaedon contains an original argument for the simplicity of the soul, and also an original argument that simples cannot suddenly disappear. It contains further original arguments that the soul must retain its rational capacities as long as it exists. Ethics. The possibility of clinical immortality raises a host of medical, philosophical, and religious issues and ethical questions. These include persistent vegetative states, the nature of personality over time, technology to mimic or copy the mind or its processes, social and economic disparities created by longevity, and survival of the heat death of the universe. Undesirability. Physical immortality has also been imagined as a form of eternal torment, as in the myth of Tithonus, or in Mary Shelley's short story The Mortal Immortal, where the protagonist lives to witness everyone he cares about die around him. For additional examples in fiction, see Immortality in Fiction. Kagan argues that any form of human immortality would be undesirable. Kagan's argument takes the form of a dilemma. Either our characters remain essentially the same in an immortal afterlife, or they do not. If our characters remain basically the same, that is, if we retain more or less the desires, interests, and goals that we have now, then eventually, over an infinite stretch of time, we will get bored and find eternal life unbearably tedious. If, on the other hand, our characters are radically changed, Example, by God periodically erasing our memories or giving us rat-like brains that never tire of certain simple pleasures, then such a person would be too different from our current self for us to care much what happens to them. Either way, Kagan argues, immortality is unattractive. The best outcome, Kagan argues, would be for humans to live as long as they desired and then to accept death gratefully as rescuing us from the unbearable tedium of immortality. Sociology. If human beings were to achieve immortality, there would most likely be a change in the world's social structures. Sociologists argue that human beings' awareness of their own mortality shapes their behavior. With the advancements in medical technology and extending human life, there may need to be serious considerations made about future social structures. The world is already experiencing a global demographic shift of increasingly aging populations with lower replacement rates. The social changes that are made to accommodate this new population shift may be able to offer insight on the possibility of an immortal society. Sociology has a growing body of literature on the sociology of immortality, which details the different attempts at reaching immortality, whether actual or symbolic, and their prominence in the 21st century. These attempts include renewed attention to the dead in the West, practices of online memorialization, and biomedical attempts to increase longevity. These attempts at reaching immortality and their effects in societal structures have led some to argue that we are becoming a post-mortal society. Foreseen changes to societies derived from the pursuit of immortality would encompass societal paradigms and worldviews, as well as the institutional landscape. Similarly, different forms of reaching immortality might entail a significant reconfiguration of societies, from becoming more technologically oriented to becoming more aligned with nature. Immortality would increase population growth, bringing with it many consequences, as, for example, the impact of population growth on the environment and planetary boundaries. Politics. Although some scientists state that radical life extension, delaying and stopping aging are achievable, there are no international or national programs focused on stopping aging or on radical life extension. In 2012 in Russia, and then in the United States, Israel, and the Netherlands, pro-immortality political parties were launched. They aim to provide political support to anti-aging and radical life extension research and technologies, and at the same time transition to the next step, radical life extension, life without aging, and finally, immortality, and aim to make possible access to such technologies to most currently living people. Some scholars critique the increasing support for immortality projects. Panayotis Penneris speculates that defeating aging as the cause of death comes with a cost, heightened stratification of humans in society, and a wider gap between social classes. Others suggest that other immortality projects like transhumanist digital immortality, radical life extension, and cryonics are part of the capitalist fabric of exploitation and control, which aims to extend privileged lives of the economic elite. In this sense, immortality could become a political economic battleground for the 21st century between the haves and have-nots. General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party Xi Jinping and President of Russia Vladimir Putin discussed organ transplants and immortality during the 2025 China Victory Day Parade. This conversation is caught recorded by China's Central Television's public broadcast. During the conversation, Putin spoke about biotechnology and human organs will continue to be transplanted, and people will become younger and younger. She responded, Putin, talking about how people predicted that life expectancy can reach up to 150 years and how 70 years old still is quite young compared to the past. At the press conference during the evening, Putin clarified to Russian media that he and Xi did discuss about the topic of human lifespan. Symbols. There are numerous symbols representing immortality. The ankh is an Egyptian symbol of life that holds connotations of immortality when depicted in the hands of the gods and pharaohs, who were seen as having control over the journey of life. The Mobius strip in the shape of a trefoil knot is another symbol of immortality. Most symbolic representations of infinity or the life cycle are often used to represent immortality, depending on the context they are placed in. Other examples include the Ouroboros, the Chinese fungus of longevity, the Tenkanji, the phoenix, the peacock in Christianity, the bill cipher and the colors amaranth in Western culture, and peach in Chinese culture.